seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth. Hey!
Spanning the continent to bring you the truth about cannabis and marijuana law reform.
I smoke pot and I like it a lot.
The Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation. Now, here's your host, Radical Russ Belville.
Good day, tokers and tokettes and non-toking lovers of liberty. It is Friday, April 2nd, 2021, and it's got to be 420 somewhere in the world, and that means tomorrow is that day that Gen Xers like myself who grew up on the first day of MTV. Yes, I had MTV on its very first day. That's how old I am. We've been waiting 39 years for tomorrow because it leads to this.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, other people have been doing Europe in the final countdown, but no, I'm going old school Peter Schilling, Major Tom Coming Home, the English version for my April 3rd, 2021 countdown reference. There you go. Coming up on today's show, we are going to get into detail about the groundbreaking marijuana legalization in the state of New York. We're going to take a look at the state of Florida, where they're trying to go backwards and institute THC caps on marijuana, medical marijuana of all things, and a disgusting look at how a prohibitionist group is trying to get the NRA to blame recent mass shootings on marijuana users. All that plus hour 2 coming up, but first, let's get you caught up on the news. This is your Cannabis Headline News, brought to you every weekday by Radical Russ Radio at radicalruss.com, your 24-hour source for marijuana music and cannabis conversations. Subscribe today for just $4.20 at patreon.com/radicalruss. With your Cannabis Headline News for the week ending Friday, March 26, 2021, I'm Russ Belville. President Joe Biden could theoretically end the policy of firing White House staff over prior marijuana use himself, Press Secretary Jen Psaki said on Wednesday, but that's not happening as long as cannabis is federally illegal. During a press briefing, Psaki was asked why the president would allow multiple people to be terminated for admitting to using marijuana in the past as part of their background check process, especially given that Vice President Kamala Harris joked about her own cannabis consumption during her 2020 presidential run.
So that isn't about anyone's personal point of view. It's about working through the process, the history, and modernizing it and taking steps to address the fact that marijuana is legal in a number of states across the country. It is still illegal federally.
A coalition of 30 members of Congress sent a letter to President Joe Biden on Thursday that criticizes the administration for terminating or otherwise punishing multiple White House staffers who admitted to past marijuana use. Representative Earl Blumenauer, co-chair of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus, led the letter, which states that the lawmakers were, quote, dismayed to learn that several White House staffers were reportedly suspended, put on probation, or asked to resign after honestly disclosing past cannabis use. The American people are demanding a change to punitive and harsh cannabis laws that have always been unequally applied, the letter states, adding that the employment policies, quote, have been applied in inconsistent and unfair ways, given that past presidents, as well as Harris and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, have admitted to using marijuana in their youth, quote, without consequences, end quote. A Republican congressman sent a letter calling on President Joe Biden to direct his administration to stop firing White House staff for admitting prior marijuana use and instead rehire people who were asked to resign solely for being honest about their history with cannabis. Representative David Joyce, a co-chair of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus, pointed out in his new letter that numerous states have moved to legalize marijuana in some form, overturning, quote, decades-long policies that are both arcane and discriminatory. He added that, quote, when used correctly and responsibly, cannabis has many proven health benefits, end quote. The opioid crisis and COVID-19 pandemic further underscore why, quote, we should be encouraging these therapies, not finding ways to further stigmatize and disenfranchise them, end quote, he wrote on Monday. A separate letter from multiple lawmakers is expected to be delivered to the White House this week. As a growing number of Democratic and Republican lawmakers criticize the Biden administration's decision to fire or otherwise punish dozens of staffers who admitted to prior marijuana use, the White House is issuing further clarification in an attempt to tamp down the swelling controversy. Press Secretary Jen Psaki has previously attempted to minimize the fallout with not much success, and so her office released a new statement on Thursday stipulating that nobody was fired for, quote, marijuana usage from years ago, nor has anyone been terminated, quote, due to casual or infrequent use during the past 12 months, end quote. Quote, the policy has allowed around a dozen White House staff to continue serving in the administration who would have not been permitted under prior administration's policies, end quote, reads the statement. All right, live listeners, I have to apologize because that's obviously not the right cannabis headline news. And that's how you know we're doing it live here at Delta 9 Studios. So let me just get that file transferred over and you can get caught up on the real news of the week that went down, the groundbreaking news of getting another legalization state. Let's see if we can get that copied and replayed. So sorry for the delay on this, and here we go. This is your Cannabis Headline News, brought to you every weekday by Radical Russ Radio at radicalruss.com. Your 24-hour source for marijuana music and cannabis conversations. Subscribe today for just $4.20 at patreon.com/radicalruss. This is your Cannabis Headline News for the week ending Friday, April 2nd, 2021. I'm Russ Belville. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo signed a marijuana legalization bill into law on Wednesday, just hours after lawmakers sent it to his desk the night before. Effective immediately, there are no penalties for public possession of up to 3 ounces of cannabis or 24 grams of marijuana concentrates. People with marijuana convictions made legal would have their records automatically expunged. Protections against discrimination in housing, educational access, and parental rights for marijuana users is in effect. Social consumption sites and delivery services will be permitted. Police could not use the odor of cannabis to justify searches. The state's existing medical cannabis program is going to be expanded and allow patients to smoke marijuana products. Patients could also obtain a 60-day rather than a 30-day supply. Home grow of 6 plants per adult, 12 plants per household will be legal, though not until within 18 months of legal cannabis sales beginning. Then adults could store 5 pounds of marijuana at home. Once legal sales begin, cannabis will be taxed at 9% by the state, 4% by the locality, and include a first-in-the-nation THC tax of ½ cent per milligram in flower, 0.8 cents in concentrates, and 3 cents in edibles. New Mexico lawmakers approved a bill to legalize marijuana for adults during a special legislative session on Wednesday, sending the years-in-the-making legislation to the desk of Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, who is expected to sign it into law. Lawmakers also passed separate legislation to expunge past convictions for low-level cannabis crimes. Under the bill, adults 21 and older could purchase and possess up to 2 ounces of cannabis, 16 grams of cannabis concentrates, and 800 milligrams of infused edibles. Home grow of 6 plants per adults, 12 plants per household will be legal, provided it is not sold or bartered. Local governments could not ban cannabis businesses entirely, as some other states have allowed. Legal retail sales wouldn't begin for another year, with no limit on the number of business licensees. Small cannabis micro-businesses, which could grow up to 200 plants, would be able to grow, process, and sell cannabis products all under a single license. Cannabis purchases will include a 12% excise tax on top of the state's regular 8% sales tax. Beginning in 2025, the excise rate would climb by 1% each year until it reached 18% in 2030. Medical marijuana products available only to patients and caretakers would be exempt from the tax. The governor of Virginia on Thursday officially proposed pushing up the timeline to implement marijuana legalization, one of a series of amendments to reform legislation that he's submitting to lawmakers, who will consider them next week. Governor Ralph Northam also addressed concerns over provisions dealing with home cultivation, expungements, and worker protections. Top legislators and reform advocates have been pushing for many of these changes, particularly moving up the effective date. The governor's proposal would make it so possession of cannabis by adults 21 and older would be legal on July 1st, rather than in 2024, as the measure currently stipulates. Home cultivation would also be allowed starting on July 1. Plants would have to be labeled with identification information out of sight of public view and out of range of individuals under the age of 21, a summary states. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said on Wednesday that a bill to federally legalize marijuana will be introduced imminently in the Senate. He made the comments on the same day that the governor of New York signed a bill to legalize adult-use cannabis, making possession of up to 3 ounces of marijuana by adults 21 and older immediately lawful.
I support decriminalization at the federal level and will be introducing legislation with a few of my colleagues shortly.
President Joe Biden's stance on marijuana legalization has not changed, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said on Tuesday.
Democrats in the Senate, led by Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, are preparing a bill to end federal prohibition of marijuana. Does President Biden support that?
He spoke about this on the campaign. He believes in decriminalizing the use of marijuana, but his position has not changed.
Descheduling, then, federal descheduling, and end of federal prohibition?
That's been his position. Nothing has changed.
She seems to be indirectly saying that Biden wouldn't support the bill being drafted by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Finance Chairman Ron Wyden, and Senator Cory Booker. While the text of that legislation has not been released, the expectation is that it will, at a minimum, federally deschedule marijuana. Biden, meanwhile, backs modestly rescheduling the plant, decriminalizing possession, legalizing medical cannabis, expunging prior marijuana records, and letting states set their own policies. Whether the president would veto a legalization bill if it arrived on his desk is another question. The Mexican Senate is prepared to approve a bill to legalize marijuana as amended by the Chamber of Deputies earlier this month, a key senator said this week. The comments came about 2 weeks after the Chamber of Deputies passed a landmark legalization bill that had been revised since it was approved by the Senate late last year. While many legislators have personally advocated for the need for reform, it's also the case that these actions come in response to a Supreme Court mandate. The court deemed the prohibition on personal possession and cultivation of cannabis unconstitutional in a 2018 ruling and tasked lawmakers with enacting a policy change. Under the proposal, adults 18 and older would be allowed to purchase and possess up to 28 grams of marijuana and cultivate up to 6 plants for personal use. Senator Rand Paul has filed legislation titled the Hemp Economic Mobilization Plan, or HEMP Act, that would triple the concentration of THC that the crop could legally contain while addressing multiple other concerns that the industry has expressed about the federal regulations. Hemp and its derivatives were legalized under the 2014 Farm Bill, and industry stakeholders have cheered USDA for quickly developing rules for the market. But they still have several reservations about provisions viewed as unnecessarily restrictive, including some addressed in Paul's bill. Arguably, the most common complaint that lawmakers have heard from hemp businesses is that the crop is federally defined as containing no more than 0.3% THC. They say that's too low, and so the bill, filed on Thursday, would increase that threshold to 1%. It would also address potential problems with testing requirements under the USDA's proposed regulations. The senator is pushing for final hemp products themselves to be tested rather than the initial flower from the plant. A top Minnesota lawmaker says a bill to legalize marijuana that has already cleared 4 House committees will receive a floor vote in the chamber next month. House Majority Leader Ryan Winkler, sponsor of the reform legislation, said it will move through its remaining committee stops by the end of April, setting the stage for action in the full chamber by May. Winkler, Speaker Melissa Hortman, and other lawmakers filed the measure in February. It would allow adults 21 and older to purchase and possess up to 1.5 ounces of marijuana and cultivate up to 8 plants, 4 of which could be mature. The House Agriculture, Finance, and Policy Committee was the latest panel to advance the bill last week. Before that, 3 other House committees approved the proposal. Its next stop is the Environment and Natural Resources Finance Committee, though a hearing has not yet been scheduled. A Rhode Island Senate panel last week heard initial testimony on legislation that would end criminal penalties for possessing small amounts of drugs and replace them with a $100 fine. Senator Tiara Mack's bill, S-604, was one of the 2 measures the panel heard Thursday that would reduce the state's current felony charge for simple drug possession. A competing measure, S-188, sponsored by Senate Majority Leader Michael McCaffrey and backed by State Attorney General Peter Nerona, would make possession of small amounts of controlled substances a misdemeanor. Mack introduced her drug decriminalization bill on the same day Governor Dan McKee unveiled a plan to legalize marijuana for adult use through his 2022 budget proposal. Legislative leaders have also introduced their own measure to legalize and regulate commercial cannabis. A Kansas House committee on Monday adopted another set of amendments to a medical marijuana legalization bill and approved the overall measure, clearing its path to a floor vote. The legislation would establish a medical marijuana program for qualified patients. As drafted, it listed 21 conditions that would qualify patients for the program, including chronic pain, HIV, and post-traumatic stress disorder. However, it was amended on Monday to expand that list. Smoking and vaping products would be prohibited, and it would not provide for home growing. A Nebraska committee on Tuesday approved a bill to legalize medical marijuana in the state. The legislation, sponsored by Senator Anna Wishart, would allow patients with certain qualifying conditions to purchase and possess up to 2.5 ounces of cannabis from licensed dispensaries. It would not allow patients to smoke marijuana, however. Members of the Judiciary Committee approved the measure in a 5-2 vote, sending the bill to the full unicameral legislature for consideration. The legislature is hoping to forestall an activist-led measure to put medical marijuana rights in the state's constitution with a simple one-line amendment that reads, "Persons in the state of Nebraska shall have the right to cannabis in all of its forms for medical purposes." A South Carolina Senate committee on Wednesday approved a bill to legalize medical marijuana in the state. The Compassionate Care Act, sponsored by Senator Tom Davis, would allow patients with qualifying conditions to possess and purchase up to 2 ounces of cannabis every 2 weeks. Members of the Senate Medical Affairs Committee passed the bill in a 9-5 vote. Quote, "You see poll after poll, even in South Carolina, even in the most conservative parts of South Carolina, showing that upwards of 70%, in some cases 80% of South Carolinians want doctors to be able to provide this to their patients if, in the doctor's opinion, it can be of benefit," end quote, Davis said. A top Texas lawmaker reaffirmed his support for medical marijuana and loosening penalties for possession last week, while the state's lieutenant governor took a crack at the White House over recent cannabis-related firings. House Speaker Dade Phelan said during a Texas Young Republicans event that members of the group, quote, "like talking about cannabis." And while personally admitting he wouldn't be able to distinguish marijuana from oregano, he said, quote, "I understand the issue," end quote. The speaker said that he voted for a limited medical cannabis legalization bill during his freshman year in the legislature, and his support for the reform is partly based on the fact that he has, quote, "a sister with severe epilepsy and small amounts of CBD oil makes a big difference in people's lives," end quote. With more states legalizing marijuana, advocates are renewing the push to allow medical marijuana in North Carolina. 16 states have approved recreational use of marijuana. New York became the latest on Wednesday, and 36 allow doctors to recommend it for medicinal uses. A handful of advocates went door to door in the General Assembly on Thursday, talking with lawmakers about passing medical marijuana legislation in North Carolina. Some said they have medical conditions they feel could be improved through cannabis use. In addition to the medical benefits, the members of the state chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws say legal weed could generate tax revenue for the state and become a cash crop for farmers. Senate Pro Tem Phil Berger said there appears to be more support among lawmakers for some decriminalization, but not so much on legalization, even for medicinal use. The Hawaii House on Wednesday adopted a resolution seeking an exemption from the Drug Enforcement Administration, stipulating that the state is permitted to run its medical cannabis program without federal interference. Separately, the Senate approved 2 resolutions calling on state officials to study the therapeutic benefits of psilocybin mushrooms and create a plan that would provide equitable access to the fungi for adult patients. For the cannabis measure, the legislation asks the state health department to seek an exception to regulations from DEA and to petition for a rulemaking process that would clarify that state-level legalization is not in violation of federal drug laws. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis suggested today's medical marijuana may be too strong, with rhetoric seemingly bolstering a proposal currently in the legislature. But he also says he's not moving on it, showing the policy line a GOP governor walks on cannabis issues. Monday in Tallahassee, DeSantis told reporters that today's cannabis hits different than the more innocent variants of bygone times. Quote, "If you look at some of the stuff that's now coming down, there's a lot of really bad things in it," said DeSantis, without explaining what those things or stuff may be. Continuing, quote, "It's not necessarily what you would have had 30 years ago when someone's in college and they're doing something," end quote. Despite those concerns, DeSantis said he is not backing a THC cap. Legislation would cap THC at 10% in flower, a level below that which would be therapeutic for many of the state's 500,000 medical patients. Concentrates would be capped at 60%, a number below current levels. The bill language offers no clarity as to what filler would be added to the product.
After a House-passed bill to legalize marijuana in North Dakota was rejected by the Senate last week, some senators hatched a new plan to advance the issue by referring it to voters on the 2022 ballot. While their resolution advanced through a key committee earlier this week, the full Senate blocked it on Thursday. Despite the fact that the deadline to introduce...
We'll have the full news for you on the Patreon site, of course. That sound means that it's 4:20 here in the Mountain Time Zone. Time for us to take our union-mandated safety briefing. And when we come back, we're going to get into the details of the groundbreaking marijuana legalization in the state of New York. We'll follow that up with that story from Florida, the governor saying there's bad things in marijuana today as a justification for THC caps. We've got to figure this all out.
Radical Russ here for the Idaho Citizens Coalition for Cannabis. Since 2010, the members of the Idaho Citizens Coalition have been fighting to legalize marijuana in America's last absolute prohibition state. We believe Idahoans deserve legal access to the cannabis plant in all of its forms. Find out more about the Idaho Citizens Coalition at idahocan.co. That's idahocann.co. And find us on Facebook at IdahoCan. And now, Puff Pass Ponder with Radical Russ. Of course no more teens are smoking pot these days. How was legalizing an adults-only store supposed to make it easier for teens? This has been Puff Pass Ponder with Radical Russ.
You're listening to the Russ Belville Show.
I think that as far as drug legalization, we talk about marijuana, and in terms of medical, I think I am basically for that.
You can find Radical Russ online everywhere.
420 is coming up soon. But while tokers in most western states are free to celebrate our cannabis holiday, tokers in Idaho will still go to jail. Join the Idaho Citizens Coalition this 420 on the steps of the Idaho Capitol to protest for our rights as cannabis consumers. Kind Idaho will be there with the Idaho Medical Marijuana Act. Come sign the petition and learn how to become a volunteer signature gatherer. Show your support by joining us online on 420 at 11 a.m. Mountain at facebook.com/IdahoCan.
The world of cannabis is evolving at a frenetic pace. The Russ Belville Show gets behind the headlines to take a deeper look at breaking news in our Cannabis Focus.
Well, today the focus is on the state of New York, where the governor on Wednesday signed legalization, full-on and very liberal marijuana legalization. Let's get right down to the details of what is now legal in the state of New York. Effective immediately, possession of up to 3 ounces is legal. You can have up to 3 ounces on you in New York State, New York City, 24 grams of cannabis concentrates. So almost an ounce of dab of concentrate. And this leads us to something that was breaking earlier today. I want to cover a memo that went out about cops not being able to arrest you for smoking marijuana on the sidewalk. Yeah, that's how far the marijuana legalization has gone in the state of New York, is that it is legal now to smoke marijuana anywhere you can legally smoke cigarettes, with a couple exceptions, but pretty much on sidewalks, on front stoops, and other public places. As a result, smoking marijuana in any of these locations is not a basis for an approach, stop, summons, arrest, or search. Up to 5 pounds of marijuana at home. You can possess up to 5 pounds now at home in the state of New York. Higher amounts, of course, for medical consumers. And there's still the memo goes on to indicate that you still can't give it to people under 21, that there's still crimes for illegal sales and so forth. But the big news is NYPD, which for so long has used the smell of marijuana to shake people down, can no longer do that. Smell cannot be the basis of a search, possession, even open smoking in front of a cop anywhere where it would be legal to smoke a cigarette. That is some fantastic news. Other fantastic news in this is there will be home grow, but with kind of a time delay. Once it kicks in, adults can cultivate up to 6 plants for personal use. 3 of them can be mature plants, a maximum of 12 plants per household. But there's a time delay because they got to give regulators time to come up with regulations for it, which I don't know, what would the regulations be as far as, noise or smell complaints or electrical inspections? I don't know, but they're going to give them time to come up with regulations for this. They've got up to 6 months for medical and up to 18 months for adult use from the moment the first rec sales begin. So we still have a time delay before rec sales are even going to begin because they got to come up with all the, the rules and regulations for that and have the first legal crop planted. So we may not see rec sales until next year. And then a year and a half from then, maybe home grow becomes legal at that point. So there is quite a time delay. But still, 6 plants, 12 per household, that's a pretty good deal. People with convictions for marijuana-related activity made legal under the legislation would have their records immediately, automatically expunged. Not like Oregon or other states where you have to, petition for it or go through some process. Just automatic. We're just going to wipe marijuana convictions off your record, so long as it's legal now, right? So if you were busted for less than 3 ounces, then you're fine. If you're busted for more than 3 ounces, no, probably not. Protections against discrimination in housing, educational access, and parental rights. That's something that every state needs to be adding. There's going to be a licensing system for cultivators, processors, distributors, retailers, cooperatives, and nurseries. Now, that's good to hear as well. Cooperatives, of course, being groups of people that pool together to grow plants. If they get 6 each and they can form a cooperative, they can, greatly reduce the cost of growing. And when you're talking about an urban location like New York City, that could be beneficial for a lot of people that don't have the space to be cultivating. Social consumption sites and delivery services would be permitted. There'll be marijuana lounges in New York State, maybe even before they exist in California and Oregon and Washington. It's quite amazing to me. Oh, and as far as the licensing goes, another thing that's really good about this New York legalization is micro businesses. Now, the idea of a micro business is someone who is a vertically integrated sole proprietor type entrepreneur in the marijuana space, one who cultivates their own marijuana, trims it, processes it, packages it, and then sells it and delivers it. So, a dealer. like what we've already been doing with marijuana for all these years. They got it right. Micro business licensing is exactly what we need to do. And it needs to be not too onerous. It needs to be a low-cost license that's easy to get. The minimum of regulation that allows people to just grow and sell weed. This is fantastic. Now, there's an opt-out for allowing retailers or social consumption sites by the end of this year. So they got a deadline for all these localities to decide whether they want in or not. But residents could overturn a ban by a local referendum. Kind of like what had to happen in Eastern Oregon to overturn the bans there. There's going to be a new bureaucracy created, the Office of Cannabis Management. There is a social equity goal of 50% of marijuana business licenses issued to social equity applicants. They define a social equity applicant as people who are from communities disproportionately impacted by the enforcement of cannabis prohibition, as well as minority and women-owned businesses, disabled veterans, and financially distressed farmers. So good work there as well, trying to make this as open and inclusive as possible. Now, we've got the taxes, which are low, 9% state tax, 4% local tax, but there is a first in the nation THC tax, a potency tax, 0.5 cent per milligram on flower, 0.8 cent per milligram on concentrates, and 3 cents a milligram on edibles. How does that work out? So if you're not exactly sure how that works out, think of it this way. A 1 gram bud is 1,000 milligrams. 20% THC, 20% of 1,000 milligrams would be 200 milligrams. 200 milligrams times 0.5 cent works out to $1. So for every gram of 28% THC bud or 20% THC bud, it's going to be $1 tax, which would work out to $28 tax on a 20% ounce. It would be $35 tax on a 25% ounce. It would be $42 tax on a 30% ounce. So there's going to be an extra tax added in, and the more potent, the more diggity dank your selection, the higher the tax is going to be. Still, with the 9% and the 4%, the 13% total, plus that potency tax, should be able to keep prices relatively competitive, at least for East Coast standards. The State Department of Health would oversee studies of technologies for detecting cannabis-impaired driving. I'm all for throwing money at studies to detect what we already know. Cannabis-impaired driving is not a big problem. It's not a big issue. We've got the medical cannabis program has changed to expand the list of qualifying conditions and to allow patients to smoke marijuana. And that's one of the things, it's been one of these, New York's been one of these no smoking medical marijuana states. Not anymore. Now you can smoke your medical marijuana and get a 60-day supply rather than a 30-day supply. They will allow smokable hemp flower, so CBD flower, and the current medical businesses will be able to get in on the recreational selling so long as they pay some licensing fees, pay some money to help the social equity program. So all in all, we're talking about a groundbreaking type of legalization passed through a state legislature, not through an initiative process, that could be the blueprint for future legalization states to follow. Let's hope so. When we come back, we're going to debunk those THC caps in the state of Florida. And as we close out this first hour, I've got a radical rant on how a prohibitionist group is trying to leverage the NRA into blaming mass shootings on marijuana. Ugh.
It's time for Idaho to join the rest of the nation in legalizing medical marijuana. The volunteers at Kind Idaho have proposed the Idaho Medical Marijuana Act and are collecting signatures now to place it on the ballot. Visit kindidaho.org to learn more. Become a volunteer signature gatherer for Kind Idaho to help collect the over 65,000 signatures needed to put medical marijuana on the November 2022 ballot. Polls show it will pass. Please visit kindidaho.org today. Now, as a service to listeners considering the use of pharmaceutical medications that, unlike marijuana, are approved for medical use by the Federal Food and Drug Administration, the Russ Belville Show presents the Big Pharma Ad of the Day.
Trulicity is a once-weekly injectable medicine to improve blood sugar in adults with type 2 diabetes when used with diet and exercise. Do not take Trulicity if you have a personal or family history of medullary thyroid cancer, if you have multiple endocrine neoplasia syndrome type 2, or if you're allergic to Trulicity.
Wait, hold up. How am I supposed to know whether I'm allergic to a drug that I've never taken?
Common side effects include nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, decreased appetite, and indigestion.
Well, that ought to keep me from eating the sweets.
Some side effects can lead to dehydration, which may worsen kidney problems.
Medical marijuana. Not approved by the FDA, and it's good for the nausea other drugs cause.
You're not high. You're listening to the Russ Belville Show.
I drank beer heavily and tried drugs enthusiastically.
All right, maybe you're high, too. Good for you.
The Coffee Pod in Sumter, Oregon is your fast, friendly marijuana shop nestled in the beautiful Elkhorn Mountain Range outside of Baker City. We're serving Eastern Oregon and Idaho's Treasure Valley with the selection of flower, pre-rolls, vapes, dab, and edibles you need at the prices that make it well worth the drive. Don't venture to some well-watched parking lot in some border town dispensary just to take a number and wait in a long line for your cannabis products. Make the drive to the Coffee Pot in Sumter and deal one-on-one with your bud tender with no waiting. See, feel, and smell the products you're after and make your purchase knowing your tax dollars are helping a small tourist community that needs it. Plus, every dollar you spend is a point toward our Bong Bucks program that earns you coupons on glass and accessories. The Coffee Pot also honors our military, seniors, teachers, and first responders with a 10% discount. And as always, OMMP patients pay no 20% tax. Come on up to the Coffee Pot in Sumter, the first business on the left, on the side of the 2-story log cabin restaurant, and tell them Radical Russ sent you.
Marijuana is an addictive drug which produces in its users insanity, criminality, and death. Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. If the hideous monster Frankenstein came face-to-face with the monster of marijuana, he dropped dead from fright. You know, it's not easy countering 7 decades of propaganda in a 2-hour show, but let's try. It's time for the Russ Belville Show's Reefer Madness Debunked.
Well, the latest reefer madness to make it to the cannabis discussion comes in the form of THC caps. Not talking about branded hats with marijuana leaves on them. I'm talking about the idea that the marijuana today is so potent, it's so terribly strong, it's so diggity dank and crizzily chronic that we've got to limit it. Because if it's too powerful, well, bad things will happen. And the latest attempt at this comes from the state of Florida, where there's a bill moving through the legislature there to cap THC in their medical marijuana program. So remember, we're talking about medical marijuana. We're not talking about the recreational market. The market for medical patients, they want to cap the THC in the flower to just 10%. Oh, yeah, that's medical. Sure, 10%. Woohoo, yeah. Oh, we're all for 10%. What, are you crazy? 10%? Look, I'm the inventory manager for a dispensary in Eastern Oregon, and we've got 18 different strains of cannabis on the shelf. The lowest THC in any of those strains is 18%. Nothing below that will really sell. We've got some joints on the shelf that are 10%. Nobody buys them. And especially when we're talking about medical marijuana patients, these are the people who have the ailments and the diseases and the conditions that need more potency. Look, if you go to the medical patients in Florida right now and you sample what they are smoking, it's going to be at least 15%. You're going to find 20s. You may even find 30% when you look at the cannabis flower. So if that patient is currently, let's just go low. If that patient's currently using 20% flower and you cap that flower at 10%, what's that patient going to do? Well, you remember your basic arithmetic, right? He's going to use twice as much. And the whole problem, think of the hypocrisy of this legislature, right? Because when medical marijuana first passed in the state of Florida, they wouldn't allow smoking. Because smoking's bad, you see. Smoke is smoke, and smoke is bad, and it's bad, and so you shouldn't do it, see? So they banned it. They said medical patients couldn't smoke it. And there was a big fight they had to go through to decide whether it was constitutional, because this is a constitutional amendment, the medical marijuana in Florida, whether it was violating people's constitutional rights to say they couldn't have flower to smoke. And that finally got settled by saying, yes, you could smoke flower. But now you want to cap it at 10% to force people to smoke at least twice as much of it or more? Which is it? Is the smoking bad or is the smoking not bad? And it's such a ridiculous thing. They also want to cap concentrates at 60%, which is like the whole reason that you're getting a concentrate is right there in its name. Concentrate. You're trying to get as much concentrated potency as possible. So why limit it to 60? Because, there's not like a natural percentage that dab should be, right? I mean, you can purify and get this to as high as, 90% if you know the proper techniques and chemistry and such. So what are we adding to it to keep it down below 60? Because, again, I run a dispensary, and it's rare that I see a concentrate that's below 60. And if it's there, it doesn't sell very well. So this idea of THC caps, especially when we're talking about medical patients who are the people that need more potency, they need more THC to battle that pain, to battle those seizures, whatever it might be. So to add idiocy to insult, the governor there, Ron DeSantis, was asked about this, whether or not he supports this idea of THC caps. He was this Monday, and he's asked by these reporters, what do you think about this, bill about the THC caps moving through the legislature? And he says, well, today's cannabis is different. Hits different than the more innocent varieties of bygone times. And here's the quote backing that up. Governor DeSantis says, quote, if you look at some of the stuff that's now coming down, there's a lot of really bad things in it. It's not necessarily what you would have had 30 years ago when someone's in college and they're doing something. You have some really, really bad stuff in there. So I think having the ability to identify that, I think that's safety. And quite frankly, when you've get into some of that stuff, it's not medicinal at that point for sure. End quote. Like, I don't even know if he's certain what he knows what THC is. That, like, is he thinking it's something else that's in it? Because the only thing that we've got in the pot that we wouldn't have had 30 years ago is higher THC and less CBD. But what you might have found 30 years ago were pesticides and paraquat and mold and mildew and seeds. And so, yeah, it is different. But what's the bad stuff in there? Because we're talking about THC caps. So the only thing he could be referring to is the extra THC. That somehow the extra THC is a bad thing. And how can it be a bad thing if it's the medicine that the people are using it for? How can more of the active ingredient, when it's non-toxic, be a bad thing? And this is what happens when we have legislators that are, bowed by these law enforcement lobbies and these scare stories. They hear some scare story, some scare stat about psychosis. They hear some scare story or see some video of kids doing mega dabs and passing out or something like that and think the solution to it is a potency limit. And the other thing that contributes to this in the minds of people that support this kind of thing is a misunderstanding of THC and analogizing it to alcohol. And that's partially our fault because for so many years we said treat marijuana like alcohol. And so we got kind of cemented in some people's head. Okay, well, we have different laws for beer than we have for wine, than we have for liquor. And in some states for liquor, we have potency limits. Can't be over 90 proof or can't be over 120 proof or whatever the proof might be. But we have potency limits. Some states won't let you have Everclear alcohol, the 91% alcohol or whatever proof it is. 95, 97, whatever. So that's the problem, is that kind of thinking is exhibited by people like DeSantis who just think potency equals bad. If it's more potent, it's more likely to kill you, like in the case of alcohol. You drink a bottle of Jack Daniels, you could die of alcohol poisoning. So they bring that thinking into cannabis, thinking, well, if it's 10% is what we had back in the Woodstock days, and now 30% is what they got the shelves in California, well, it must be 3 times as bad because marijuana is bad. But it's not. Marijuana is not bad. It never was. It's not anymore, and it never was. And once they start to understand this a little better, we'll all be in better shape. What a silly little tune. All right, we're going to take a break and come back with time for a radical rant, how a prohibitionist group is calling on the NRA to blame marijuana for the mass shootings and how it could be politically advantageous for both of them. Wow. And you thought they couldn't stoop any lower, huh? This is Russ Belville for Cannabis Headline News.
Get the day's top 5 news stories in marijuana in just 5 minutes every weekday with Cannabis Headline News. Available now to paid subscribers at patreon.com/RadicalRuss or listen at the top of every hour on the 24-hour Radical Russ radio stream at radicalruss.com. You're listening to Radical Russ Radio, where it's 420, 24/7, 365.
And now, Puff, Pass, Ponder with Radical Russ. If marijuana is as harmful as some people say it is, how come nobody ever sued their weed dealer for damages? This has been Puff, Pass, Ponder with Radical Russ.
In the interest of fair and balanced journalism, the Russ Belville Show presents the anti-drug public service announcement of the day.
When she was 6, after a few scrapes and tumbles, her dad taught her how to ride a two-wheeler. When she was 9, he helped her build a telescope that could see the moons of Jupiter. When she was 14, after a lot of giggling and giving up, her mom finally taught her how to hit a wicked two-handed backhand. All through her growing up, Susie's parents taught her well. But for all their love and attention, there was one lesson left untaught. Susie's parents never taught her about drugs. They never told her that drugs maim, drugs kill. So Susie learned one final lesson on her own. When you don't say no to your kids about drugs, it's the same as saying yes.
This has been the Russ Belville Show's anti-drug public service announcement of the day, exclusively on RadicalRuss.com.
We must wage what I have called total war against public enemy number one.
I support a change in law to end federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
That marijuana, pot, grass, whatever you want to call it, is probably the most dangerous drug.
Some think there won't be room for them in jail. We'll make room.
I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it and didn't inhale.
One major responsibility is to encourage people to use less drugs.
Entirely legitimate topic for debate.
Radical Rant.
For today's rant, we take a look at a newsletter that I received from a group called Americans Against Legalizing Marijuana. It's ALM. And they've got a subsidiary called Californians Against Legalizing Marijuana called CALM. And this newsletter is maybe one of the more offensive things I've read from drug prohibitionists. It's a pretty deep list with a strong bench. So I don't know if it's the most offensive thing I've ever read. But given the actions of the past few weeks where we've had a return to normal, which means a return to mass shootings. We had the terrible shooting in Atlanta and the other one in Boulder, and now one that happened in Southern California. Just, again, we're getting to the point where it's too many to keep track of. So in the context of this, of us returning to these horrible mass shootings, there is a letter from Americans Against Legalizing Marijuana, and I'm just going to read it to you, and then we'll talk about it. An open letter to the NRA from lifetime members and drug prevention activists. There is a clear and well-researched connection between drug use and violent crimes, including mass shootings. The role of marijuana-induced psychosis, which is becoming more common, in violence is also well documented. If we expect to maintain gun rights in this country, the National Rifle Association, or NRA, must recognize and begin speaking from this truth. NRA needs to call attention to marijuana-induced psychosis as a cause of mass shootings. The NRA needs to fight for toxicology discovery and reporting it in all gun violence incidents. The auto response to every mass shooting seems to be more gun control. Yet, as the NRA and its members are always quick to point out, it is the shooter who is out of control. The National Rifle Association is powerful enough to help our politicians focus on the root cause of mass shootings. It also has the ability to educate the public, media, and elected officials about the probable culprit in these mass shootings. The NRA needs a defensible position against mass shootings and gun violence that will protect gun rights, guns, and gun owners. We ask the NRA to promote a national bill that would be turned into law to drug test all mass murder suspects at a minimum and make results open to the public to see within a reasonable time frame. The results will be eye-opening for many. As members of the NRA and drug prevention organizations, we see that marijuana psychosis and polysubstance abuse are playing a substantial role in mass shooting incidents around the USA. Getting the toxicology on mass shooting events is essential to forming public policies that can actually address this national crisis. In our experience, even when positive test results of such perpetrators are found, there is precious little publicity. So we believe it is critical that there is public release of the test results. We also plead with the media, editors, and crime reporters to make the substance use history of the shooter a standard follow-up story to any mass shooting incident. As early as the 1960s, experts noted a connection between heavy cannabis use and paranoia. Often these people imagined they were being followed. Of course they were hallucinating. They were not being followed. This was back in the decades when cannabis was far lower in THC potency, the cannabinoid in marijuana that causes mental disorientation. Most pot was 2 to 3% THC. Present levels of THC in marijuana plant and product form far exceed that. Some reach THC levels nearing 100% and cause greater mental problems, including psychotic breaks, psychosis, and schizophrenia. News reports about the most recent shooter in Boulder, Colorado, clearly reveal that he was paranoid and experiencing hallucinations about being followed. We need authorities to follow this evidence to the facts. What substance or substances were in his system which influences his disoriented thinking and unspeakable acts of violence? The people promoting drug legalization are happy to let the NRA and their Second Amendment advocacy become the fall guy for every mass shooting. It is time to place the blame where it actually belongs. We need to address all causes of violence and mass murder. Mass murder is on the rise. We have to ask what has changed in society to increase the numbers of mass murders. Two of the things that have changed are the increase of marijuana use and its potency. And then it's signed by all these Americans Against Legalizing Marijuana people who are also other people that are lifetime NRA members as well. So let's just break this down a little bit. The NRA needs to call attention to mass-induced psychosis as a cause of mass shootings. A cause of mass shootings. We need to... Now, never mind that this marijuana that's so potent is not limited to the United States of America. There's plenty of potent marijuana in Britain, in the UK, in France, in Australia. What they don't have is easy access to guns. So even if, and again, let me make the if like 80-point font, bold-faced, italicized, and blinking red. Even if marijuana were the cause of these mass psychosis things that they're talking about, the psychosis that happens, the answer would be to not let mass psychosis people that are crazy on the killer demon weed have easy access to guns. Wouldn't it? Because it's not like making marijuana illegal is going to make the marijuana go away. There will still be that highly potent marijuana that makes people axe murderer crazy, and they'll still be able to get guns. I mean, they have such strict gun control in England, and they have highly potent marijuana there, and yet nobody's getting guns and shooting people up. So let's take a look at what the real problem is in America. The the unfettered access to guns and ammo. And I say this as a gun owner. I say this as a person who supports the Second Amendment, who believes we have a right to have a gun to protect ourselves and to be a part of a militia. But that's not something that's just an unfettered right that anybody, any old yahoo should be able to have. No. We need to have a society that functions. So they're trying to get the NRA on their side to get mass shootings blamed on pot. And it's just such a naked political move because they know as Americans against legalizing marijuana, only a quarter of America agrees with them. Only 1 out of 4 Americans agree with them. So this is like, they're trying to get clout on Instagram by surfing on someone's mentions or something. They're trying to get the NRA on their side. Look, the NRA's got their own troubles at this moment. They're bankrupt and allegations of Russian interference. I mean, I don't really think they're got their alarms going off to get on the side of the anti-pot people. Like the NRA needs to be less popular right now, right? Come on. So it's a disgusting letter, disgusting concept, and not one that's rooted in science, because at the bottom of their letter, we recommend the following resources to the NRA and any interested public officials. And they got their list of various websites and reports, right? So, you know me, I look shit up. And one of the main sources they have here, who's also one of the signatories to the letter, is David G. Evans, Esquire, the senior counsel for the Cannabis Industry Victims Educating Litigators, or CIVEL is his group. And he's got a paper called Marijuana and Violence. So I decided to look that paper up and read it. And a lot of what he bases this on is a Secret Service report. And he writes, according to the U.S. Secret Service, between January and December 2017, there were 28 incidents of mass attacks, during which 3 or more persons were harmed, that were carried out in public places within the United States. And it goes on to talk about, he says, marijuana use causes psychosis, and it's a whole bunch of bunk, right? But he bases this off of reports from the Secret Service. So, me, I looked shit up. I went and found the Secret Service report that he's referring to. Now, these reports are done every year. So the report he referred to is 2017. The one I've got is the most recent one, the 2019 one. And under substance use, when they're talking about mass attacks in the United States in 2019, nearly half of the attackers, 46%, had a history of using illicit drugs, for example, cocaine, methamphetamine, LSD, ecstasy, or misusing prescription medications, for example, Xanax, Adderall, Vivance. For 2/5 of the attackers, 41%, the use of these substances and or alcohol or marijuana may have reached the level of abuse causing negative consequences in their lives, including criminal charges, academic failures, court-ordered treatment, and eviction. So, 41% of the mass attacks that happen. Oh, by the way, and he says, how the mass attacks are going up. Well, actually, they went down. 2019, they went down. So they've been going down as the marijuana has been getting more potent. But anyway, when you look at the stats, it was 46% with a mental health problem, which is down from the 67% the year before. And when you look at that mental health page, right? Remember they were saying about in the previous stat, they said 41% had such problem that it was, medically substance use issue. So according to this Secret Service report from 2019, it says from the Centers of Disease Control, they estimate over half the population of the United States will be diagnosed with a mental health disorder at some point in their lifetime, with 20% of adults experiencing mental health symptoms each year. So having a mental health issue is something that's fairly common in America. And they say over half the population will have one. And we're getting 41% of the ones of the shooters had a problem. So doesn't that put us at less than the lifetime incidence? Of course, people that commit mass shootings are going to have a mental health issue. Mentally healthy people don't seek to murder a bunch of people in a public space. And you got that whole chicken and the egg issues, right? Like, if someone's got a mental health issue, oftentimes they're using cannabis to cope with it, to deal with this. You don't know that the cannabis caused the mental health issue. It may be they had the mental health issue and used cannabis to deal with it. It's just disgusting, and Alm should be ashamed of itself. We'll talk a little bit more about it in the next hour. Plus, in the next hour, more on New York legalization. Colorado is auctioning off 420 vanity plates, and in-depth look at the voting rights abomination that's going on in the state of Georgia. For everyone here in America's last absolute prohibition state, I'm Radical Russ. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, take care of each other, tokers.
Grow it, you try it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth.